Have you ever heard of a country so small that many people never even knew it existed, but which could disappear before the end of this century? Can you imagine an archipelago in the middle of the Pacific with crystal clear waters, a vibrant Polynesian culture, and only 12,000 inhabitants living just a few steps away from being swallowed up by the sea? Such a place exists, and it's called Tuvalu. Today, Bello Mundo takes you to discover one of the most unknown and, at the same time, most endangered countries on the planet. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. It costs nothing, and you're supporting the channel to keep bringing you incredible content. Number 1. Location and geographical data. If you've ever thought of disappearing off the map and living in an isolated paradise, Tuvalu could be the perfect destination. But you'd better hurry, because it's in danger of disappearing, literally. With only 26 square kilometers and a population of 12,000 inhabitants, this archipelago in the middle of the Pacific is made up of 9 atolls, making it one of the smallest and most isolated countries in the world. But apart from its small size, what really stands out is that Tuvalu is on the front line of climate change. Its islands are only a few meters above sea level, which means that if scientists' predictions are right, the country could simply disappear in the next few decades. To give you an idea of the risk, some of the islands are barely 4 or 5 meters above the ocean. In some areas, you can walk just a few steps and see the sea on both sides. Can you imagine what happens when the tide rises higher than normal? It is exactly this scenario that makes Tuvalu one of the most vulnerable nations. The climate there is tropical maritime, i.e., hot and humid all year round, with rainfall concentrated between November and February. But despite the frequency of rainfall, the lack of drinking water is a serious problem, as there are no rivers or freshwater lakes. All the water consumed comes from cisterns that store rainwater. The country has already become a global symbol in the fight against rising sea levels. At international conferences, its leaders never tire of calling for urgent action to prevent their islands from being swallowed up by the ocean before it's too late. But will this be enough to stop Tuvalu disappearing from the map? Number 2. History. Now that we understand where Tuvalu is, let's go back in time to find out how this almost invisible little piece of the map became an independent country. In the distant past of the Pacific, Polynesian navigators crossed the ocean in canoes, braving unpredictable currents and storms until they found these islands. Like many lands in Polynesia, Tuvalu was colonized through these daring expeditions, which served both to trade and to expand territories and cultures. The customs, myths, and traditions brought by these first inhabitants are still alive today. Moving into the 19th and 20th centuries, Tuvalu, which at the time did not yet have that name, was annexed by the British Empire, along with the Gilbert Islands, which today form Kiribati. This joint territory became known as the Gilbert and Ellice Islands. But then came the problem. While the people of Kiribati were of Micronesian origin, the inhabitants of Tuvalu were Polynesians. Differences in culture, language, and social organization meant that coexistence was not the most peaceful. This cultural tension lasted until 1974, when a referendum decided to separate the two regions once and for all. The Gilberians kept their territory, while the Ellice Islands adopted the name Tuvalu and began to move towards independence, which they officially achieved in 1978. That's why, to this day, Tuvalu's flag still has the Union Jack in the top left-hand corner, representing the British past. But even when it became independent, Tuvalu maintained ties with the former metropolis. The head of state is still the king, currently King Charles III, but the government functions as an independent constitutional monarchy, with a governor-general representing the crown. The country's history also has a chapter involving the Second World War. During the conflict, the islands were attacked by Japan, which was trying to expand its presence in the Pacific. However, the United States intervened and established strategic bases there, building airstrips and preventing Tuvalu from falling permanently under Japanese rule. In the end, the war accelerated the debate on autonomy and helped drive the desire for independence that would gain momentum in the following decades. Today, despite being one of the smallest countries in the world, Tuvalu is part of the Commonwealth, the community of nations formed by former British colonies. And that's not just a detail. Thanks to this alliance, the country receives external support in essential areas such as education, health, infrastructure, and the environment, something crucial for such a small and vulnerable nation. Number 3. Polynesian population, language, and culture. Now that we've understood Tuvalu's history, it's time to talk about who lives on this little piece of land in the middle of the Pacific. The country's population is around 11 to 12,000 people, which means that there are neighborhoods in large cities that have more inhabitants than the entire nation of Tuvalu. And this, of course, further reinforces the sense of community there. But does everyone know each other? Not exactly, but it's almost like that. If you go to a public event or celebration on the island, the chances of bumping into a distant relative or a friend of a friend are very high. Tuvaluan is the main language and is spoken on a daily basis. But English is also widely used, especially in schools, in official documents, and in communication with the outside world. And when it comes to culture, Tuvalu is a true Polynesian treasure. The dances, music, and traditions are directly linked to the people's history with the sea and the land. Many of these cultural manifestations are passed down from generation to generation, always valuing collectivity and respect for elders. Speaking of housing, most of the houses are simple, made from local materials such as wood, palm leaves, and woven mats. On some islands, the dwellings are still very rustic, with no electricity. In the capital, Funafuti, there is a little more infrastructure, some prefabricated buildings, small stores, and even a few guest houses for the few visitors who come. The family is the foundation of Tuvaluan society. It is not uncommon to see several generations living under the same roof or on neighboring plots of land, sharing responsibilities and looking after each other. The elders play a very important role, being consulted in almost all important community decisions. If there is a conflict or an argument, it is their word that usually decides the course of the situation. With a welcoming people and a lifestyle that revolves around the collective, Tuvalu keeps alive the essence of a traditional Polynesian society, where modernity and ancestral customs still live side by side. Number 4. Almost non-existent tourism. Remember when we said at the beginning that this would be a great place for those who want to disappear off the map? Well, it's not just figurative. Getting there is an almost impossible mission. Firstly, there are very few flights. The only regular options come from Fiji, another Pacific island country, and operate only twice a week. In other words, not only is the journey long, but access is limited. And since there aren't many transportation options, ticket prices tend to be quite high. This makes it one of the least visited countries in the world. According to the World Tourism Organization, in some years less than 2,000 tourists have set foot in the entire country. Just for comparison's sake, there are tourist destinations that receive that number of visitors per hour. Now, If on the one hand this makes tourism practically non-existent, on the other it makes the archipelago a paradise for those looking for an authentic refuge without the crowds. One of the few well-known attractions there is the Funafuti Conservation Area, an environmental preservation area full of coral reefs and incredibly blue waters. Those who enjoy snorkeling and diving can find turtles, colorful fish, and untouched coral. But unlike other tropical destinations, don't expect resorts or luxury hotels. Here, the charm lies in simplicity and pure contact with nature. Another curious detail is the airstrip in the middle of Funafuti. As there are few flights, the place ends up becoming a public space where children and young people play ball and ride their bikes when there are no planes arriving or departing. It's a perfect example of how life follows its own rhythm, very different from the rest of the world. Number 5. Economy and subsistence. And here comes the inevitable question. How does such a small country survive financially? The answer is a little complicated because the geographical limitations and lack of natural resources make the archipelago's economy extremely fragile. The basis of subsistence comes from fishing and small-scale agriculture. The population fishes for food and to sell, while products derived from coconuts, such as copra, which for those who don't know is dried coconut pulp, are sold as one of the few exports. In addition, the government issues fishing licenses to foreign vessels, which generates important revenue for the local administration. But the reality is that this is not enough to sustain a country's economy. For this reason, the island relies heavily on international aid and donations from countries like Australia and New Zealand, mainly for infrastructure projects and to deal with the impacts of climate change. Another important factor is the financial remittances sent by Tuvaluans living abroad. Many residents emigrate to find jobs in Australia and New Zealand, sending money back to their families, which helps keep the economy going. Without these transfers, the situation would be even more complicated. And as we'll see below, the country has found an unexpected source of income, which has come straight from the digital world and helped bring a financial boost to this tiny archipelago. Number 6. The famous .tv domain. Have you ever noticed that each country has a code at the end of their official websites? Brazil has .br, Argentina has .r, Japan has .jp, and by one of those ironies of fate, Tuvalu got .tv. Yes, just like television. When the internet began to become popular in the 90s, this coincidence caught the attention of TV, streaming, and entertainment companies, who soon saw great potential in the acronym. After all, having a website ending in .tv was practically a seal of authenticity for anyone working with video and broadcasting. The Tuvalu government, realizing the opportunity, made an agreement with specialized companies to license and sell this domain around the world. And the result? Today, around 10% of the country's income comes from this market. Thanks to these royalties, the money generated by .tv has helped finance infrastructure works, including road paving, improvements to the electricity grid, and even investments in education. In other words, a remote archipelago with barely any industry or natural resources has found a way to guarantee a better future for its population in the digital world. It's an incredible turnaround. While the country struggles against physical disappearance, its online presence is growing and sustaining a large part of the local economy. Number 7. Tuvalu's controversial digital future. And speaking of cyber, imagine a country that, faced with the possibility of disappearing physically, starts planning its survival in the virtual environment. It sounds like a science fiction script, but this is one of the alternatives that Tuvalu has been studying in the face of the threat of being swallowed up by the sea. If the physical territory disappears, the idea would be to create a digital nation, preserving the country's culture, laws, historical records, and identity in the metaverse or on an advanced digital platform. So, even without land, Tuvalu would still exist in some form, at least in the virtual environment. This concept raises a series of unprecedented questions. How could a country maintain its international recognition without a territory? How can rights be guaranteed to citizens who technically no longer have a physical place to call home? These are dilemmas that have never before been faced in international law. Some leaders argue that, in addition to the digital plan, concrete agreements should be signed with countries like Australia and New Zealand to take in the inhabitants who need to leave. Others believe that, regardless of the physical future of the nation, this digital project could be a first step towards ensuring that Tuvalu's identity is never forgotten. What is clear is that this small archipelago does not intend to disappear without a fight. If they can't save the islands, Tuvaluans are determined to at least save their history and culture. Number 8. Migration agreements and the uncertain future. What if the worst happens? Where will the 12,000 inhabitants of a country that may simply cease to exist go? Already anticipating a scenario of forced migration, Tuvalu has signed agreements with New Zealand and, more recently, Australia, ensuring that its citizens have somewhere to go if the waters take their land. The land of the kangaroos, for example, has announced a program that will allow up to 280 Tuvaluans to migrate annually, a symbolic number that recognizes, in practice, the so-called climate refugees, a concept not yet fully accepted in international law. But as much as the idea of relocation seems the logical solution, the issue is much more complex. Moving country doesn't just mean changing address. It means losing a way of life based on a connection to the land, ancestral customs, and local culture. No wonder many locals still resist the idea of leaving. They prefer to believe that international agreements to curb global warming and contain rising sea levels may still be enough to save Tuvalu. But will the world act quickly enough? The clock is ticking, and with each day that this uncertainty continues, the chances of Tuvalu continuing to exist, as we know it, are diminishing. And so we come to the end of our journey through Tuvalu, this little paradise lost in the middle of the Pacific that, despite being almost unknown, carries one of the most urgent stories of our time. Now I want to hear from you. What surprised you the most? The tiny size of the country, the real risk of it disappearing, or the fact that Tuvalu could become a digital nation? Let me know in the comments. And if you like exploring unusual places and stories that go far beyond the obvious, you already know. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and come with us to discover every bit of this Bello Mundo. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.